Thank you for joining us for this very important presentation on vitamin K27. This is arguably the most important dietary supplement nutrient that you can utilize in your practice and with your patients, and of course personally as well, because it's a missing ingredient that has facilitated the development of many of the chronic illnesses that your patients suffer from today. For example, things like heart disease and diabetes, various forms of cancer, even things like neuropathy, neurodegenerative diseases. All of these things seem to be linked to a deficiency in vitamin K27. Additionally, the Western diet is almost absent of vitamin K27. So when you understand the importance and the type of role that it plays within the physiology of your patients, and when you understand the deficiencies that they're experiencing, I think you'll see clearly the importance in supplementing with this particular vitamin. So let's go ahead and jump right in. So analogs of vitamin K27 that you're probably familiar with are K1, which is called phyloquinone. K1 can be found in leafy green vegetables, things like spinach, kale, broccoli, collards, things that are deep green and leafy. They tend to have high amounts of K1. K1 is the non-extrahepatic form of vitamin K2. I'll talk about what that is exactly in a couple slides. The other form is vitamin K2, but there's two forms of it. One is MK4, vitamin K24, and the other is MK7. Our interest here is in MK7, and we'll explain why that is. But MK4, what you can find out there in the market, tends to be in the synthetic form. Now, MK7 typically is found in fermented foods because it's typically produced by microbes during fermentation. It's also produced by intestinal bacteria if you happen to have the right types of microbes in the gut. You find it in things like natto, which is a fermented soybean. That's the richest natural source of vitamin K27. Certain types of fermented cheeses in Northern Europe. And then you can find MK4 naturally in organ meat and brain and other parts of the animals that we typically don't eat. The mechanism of action in general with vitamin K27 is something called carboxylation. So it's the formation of something called the GLA residue. The GLA residue is abbreviated as the GLA residue, and the GLA residue is something that you find on certain types of amino acids called glutamic acid. So the GLA residue is looks like this. It's got a strong negative form once it is carboxylated and activated by vitamin K27. So once it has this negative charge to it, it can chelate and grab onto cationic or positively charged minerals, things like calcium, magnesium, zinc, and etc. At this point, there are 12 different human GLA proteins that have been identified within the body that require activation by vitamin K27. So this entire mechanism is called carboxylation. It's basically the activation of proteins that have this GLA residue in them. So well-known tissues that require vitamin K in general, the first one is the liver, and the liver utilizes vitamin K, as I mentioned before, K1, primarily for the activation of clotting factors to facilitate the clotting cascade. So it activates different factors so that the clotting cascade can proceed on to developing a formal blood clot. That's why in people that are taking Coumadin and warfarin, anticoagulants, vitamin K1 tends to be contraindicated for Coumadin and warfarin, because the way those drugs work is by interfering with the vitamin K1 function in the liver. So they are K antagonist anticoagulants. And so if you're taking vitamin K1 supplements, you're kind of going against the goal of those drugs. Of course, those drugs and the benefit of using them is always questionable. So, but that's for another topic. Right now, let's focus on what K1 and K2 is. Now, the other area that requires vitamin K are the bones. So vitamin K2, and in particular K27, and of course there are numerous studies on K24 as well. But typically K24 is used in an injection format. We'll talk about why that is. But vitamin K2 plays a very important role in activating a protein called osteocalcin. Osteocalcin is a protein that puts calcium on the bones, and it requires the activation process by vitamin K2-7. Other areas that require vitamin K2 are the arteries. There's something called a matrix GLA protein, a very interesting protein. It's the only known protein or substance or mechanism in the body for removing calcium from soft tissues like the inner walls of the arteries itself. So one of the issues with calcium is that it's an inert mineral. It's a rock essentially, and once you consume it, it gets into your circulatory system, and if it's not properly directed, it ends up getting embedded into your soft tissue. And of course, that leads to arterial calcification. So vitamin K2 activates the only protein known to actually undo this calcification. Principles of vitamin K uptake in the tissue. So this is basically how it is utilized in the body once you consume it through diet or as a supplement. So the liver first takes what it needs. All of vitamin K's, whether it's K1 or K2, get absorbed through the intestinal lining through an active transport system. The active transport system are actually these chylomicrons, these little vitamin K2 carriers that our body produces, which actually indicates how important this vitamin is because our body produces a carrier specific for it. It finds it in the intestines, in the lumen of the intestines, and grabs it and pulls it through and takes it through the portal vein and directly to the liver. Now, the liver utilizes the vitamin K that it needs first. If the liver is deficient in vitamin K, you're not going to be able to conduct a very important clotting system in your body. And so one could basically die from a simple cut, or one could die from internal bleeding just by bumping against something and starting a process of internal bleeding. And so vitamin K is extremely important in the liver to allow the clotting cascade to function. So the liver takes what it needs, and what the liver doesn't need, the remaining K, is sent outside of the liver called extrahepatic vitamin K, and it's sent out for the other tissues in the body. As we mentioned earlier, bones require vitamin K, arteries require vitamin K, and we'll talk about other ones that do as well. Vitamin K deficiency, because of this process, typically occurs in the extrahepatic tissue. So in an average person, you hardly ever see vitamin K1 or K deficiency in the liver. But what you do see is severe vitamin K deficiency in extrahepatic tissue, tissues that are outside of the liver. We'll talk about what those diseases are specifically. Effects of vitamin K deficiency are typically more pronounced than in bones, cartilage, arteries, and as you'll come to find out, things like muscles, nerves, in your brain, and so on. So vitamin K deficiency affects the whole other parts of your body rather than your liver itself. So now let's focus a little bit on vitamin K and bone health and exactly how it functions in bone health, and then also some of the studies that have been done to illustrate the importance of vitamin K in bone health. So it's important to keep in mind how vitamin K actually functions in bone health. So as most people know, vitamin D is extremely important for bone health. Now, the reason vitamin D is particularly important, and especially vitamin D3, is because it stimulates osteoblastic cells, those are the bone building cells, to release osteocalcin. As you may recall from earlier slides, osteocalcin is a bone-building protein. It's a protein that actually grabs calcium and actually sticks it on the bone itself. And so osteoblastic cells release this osteocalcin when it's stimulated by vitamin D, a natural, sensible first step. The problem is osteocalcin is released in what we call an inactive form. So it is not functional when it's released by the osteoblastic cells. It requires activation by vitamin K2-7 or K2 in order to get activated into its active form. Once it's activated, it can of course take calcium and stick it on the bone. So vitamin K2 becomes the critical last step in developing bone and building bone and calcification of bone in the appropriate way. Osteocalcin actually acts as a glue. And so one of the problems here that you start to see is excessive amounts of vitamin D actually leads to more higher levels of release of osteocalcin, but it's an inactive form, as I mentioned before. And so you use up all of your body's vitamin K2 in order to activate all of the osteocalcin that's being released, leading to a severe vitamin K2 deficiency. And that's why vitamin D by itself can actually cause numerous problems when taken at very high doses for a long period of time. There was a recent study published this year that was released that showed that vitamin D can increase the risk for heart disease. The reason for that is because if you take too much vitamin D and don't get enough vitamin K2, then you're basically depleting your body of vitamin K2 because it's working hard to continue to activate this osteocalcin. And once your body's depleted of vitamin K2, if you recall previously, the matrix GLA protein that is supposed to remove calcium from your arteries no longer functions. So vitamin K2 does not prevent the calcification that naturally will start to occur. It's not present in order to prevent that. Now, the other function of vitamin K2 is actually to reduce bone resorption. Bone resorption is a process that goes on a regular basis where your body looks to bone, which is a calcium store, to grab calcium in order to use it in other things like muscle contraction, nerve conduction, and so on. Vitamin K2 slows down this process of bone resorption, which typically tends to be at a fairly high rate in many people. So you tend to lose more bone than you can actually build, and that creates a net effect of having a weak bones. Estrogen does a great job of preventing this as well. And this is one of the reasons why once women hit perimenopausal and postmenopausal ages where their estrogen levels are low, they tend to get higher rates of bone resorption and their bones get weaker faster. So vitamin K2 and osteocalcin. As I mentioned, osteocalcin is a key protein. It's a vitamin K dependent protein that creates the actual bone matrix itself, upon which calcium is then crystallized to create the strong, intense, honeycomb-like structure that is characteristic of bone. Osteocalcin provides the glue that is essential for this process and gives the structure and order to bone tissue itself. Without appropriate amounts of osteocalcin, bone tends to be really fragile and easily broken. It doesn't have that strength. Vitamin K, of course, activates this osteocalcin through a process that we talked about earlier called carboxylation. And without the carboxylated osteocalcin, calcium simply cannot properly be utilized by bone structures. So osteocalcin carboxylation and studies on bone mineral density and fracture rates. So these are two papers, UCOC. UCOC stands for undercarboxylated osteocalcin. So undercarboxylated is the inactive form of osteocalcin. This study it published showed that undercarboxylated osteocalcin is inversely correlated with BMD, meaning higher levels of undercarboxylated osteocalcin, lower degrees of bone mineral density. A second study published a few years afterwards confirmed the exact same thing in another large population study. So there's a direct effect of osteocalcin activation and the ability to actually mineralize bone. Serum UCOC predicts hip fractures really well. That's what this study had predicted, that serum levels of undercarboxylated osteocalcin, again, that's the inactive form of osteocalcin, predicts hip fractures, and in fact predicts hip fractures better than any other marker there is. Serum undercarboxylated osteocalcin predicts hip fractures was again verified by a completely separate group publishing in a very similar type of study. So they basically verified the findings of the first group. High levels of undercarboxylated osteocalcin was associated with a 6-fold increase in fracture rates, which was published in a separate study after the four studies that I'm illustrating here. So basically, this study verified that not only is high levels of undercarboxylated osteocalcin correlated with lower levels of bone mineral density, also correlated with a higher prediction rate of hip fractures. It also showed a 6-fold increase risk in hip fractures. 6-fold increase is a tremendous increase in the rate and prevalence of hip fractures just by missing the single vitamin that does this one of these very important jobs, which is activating this protein. Natural vitamin K27, which is what we're talking about here, also abbreviated MK7, has been shown to be particularly effective in bone health. For example, this study published in 2001 showed high consumption levels of MK7, which is K27, from natto resulted in better levels of activated osteocalcin and thus reduced fracture risk. We saw in the previous study that high levels of undercarboxylated or inactive osteocalcin was completely directly correlated or related to fracture risk and, of course, bone mineral density as well. This 2006 paper showed that natto consumption helps prevent the development of osteoporosis. So they were able to actually measure the rates of osteoporosis and the progression among people that consume natto, which has the highest natural source of vitamin K27, versus people that did not. This 2008 study showed that better vitamin K status attributed to natto consumption resulted in reduction of hip fractures. So this is a direct correlation study or causative study that shows that consumption of this particular food, which tends to be very high in vitamin K27, is directly related and results with reduction in hip fracture. So the data couldn't be more clear. Hip fracture rates and K2 as MK7 in particular. This study showed that dietary intakes of calcium, magnesium, vitamin D, and vitamin K were analyzed in a nationwide survey in Japan. Hip fracture incidence rate tends to be much higher in the western part of Japan, and the western part of Japan, incidentally, doesn't consume natto. The strongest inverse correlations were found for vitamin K in both men and women. So the increased risk and increased prevalence rate of hip fractures in the western part of Japan, the one factor that drove a real clear correlation was the amount of vitamin K found in the diet of those people. Calcium intake had weak or no association at all, so it didn't matter how much calcium people took. It did not really have any impact on the hip fracture rate. And basically they concluded that MK7 from natto attributed to the reduced risk of fractures in the eastern population of Japan. That's the part of Japan that eats high levels of natto. So this population longitudinal study showed that vitamin K27 consumption through the food natto at high levels in the same kind of demographic. We're talking about Japan in a single country, just separated by the consumption of natto, no consumption of natto, showed significant disparities in the amount of hip fracture rates and risks. Now let's talk a little bit about vitamin K2 and vascular and heart health as well. So this magazine in 2005 really was illustrating the issue of knowing your calcium score. So calcium score is really a way of measuring, utilizing a high-speed CT. We're measuring the amount of calcium deposition in people's soft tissues, in particular the arteries in your body. And doctors for a long time have been looking at like the great risk factors and great predictors of cardiovascular risk. And they've looked at cholesterol, they've looked at CRP, they've looked at, of course, family history, lifestyle issues like smoking, alcohol consumption, they've looked at obesity. All of these things have some correlation with heart disease, but they're not that direct of an impact. For example, about 50% of people that suffer from heart disease have normal cholesterol levels. They don't have elevated cholesterol like is assumed to be in everybody with heart disease. And so the question always has been is what's the best predictor of calcification and what's the best predictor of heart disease risk in people? And they've come up with something called the calcium score, the degree of calcification in your arteries. This was one of the first studies that were done on this. Basically, they took 3 donors who had suffered from heart attacks, and they took atherosclerotic human aortas and they examined them under a microscope and then something called von Casa staining that looks for calcification. And basically what they showed is that in a healthy aorta, you tend to have very, very high levels of vitamin K27, as you see here. In an unhealthy aorta, you have almost no detectable levels of vitamin K27 at all. And you tend to see high degrees of calcification and stiffening and plaque formation. In the healthy pink good natural aorta, you tend to see high degree of vitamin K27 and thus no calcification, no plaque formation at all. So these are some studies that have shown further research that verifies this. This is a study that was done as part of the Prospect EPIC cohort study of 16,000 patients of women who were enrolled between 1993 and 1997. They were between the ages of 49 and 70, and they were free of cardiovascular disease at their baseline, and their intake of vitamin K and other nutrients were estimated based on a food frequency questionnaire to see what types of foods they were eating and how much of these nutrients they were getting. The conclusion was a high intake of menaquinones, again, vitamin K27, could protect against cardiovascular disease. However, more research is necessary, they said, to define the optimal levels. And so other studies have popped up now to study the same thing. This study then published in the Journal of Atherosclerosis and basically concluded that high dietary menaquinone intake is associated with reduced coronary calcification. And then, of course, they go on to explain that coronary calcification is the #1 risk factor that leads to heart attacks. And this was in a study done in 564 postmenopausal women. And this was kind of a follow-up study to the original one that showed a correlation. Other studies, one of my favorite studies is called the Rotterdam study. The objective of the study was to show the association of dietary intake of vitamin K1 and K2 with aortic calcification, cardiovascular disease, and cardiovascular and total mortality in general. So it was a cross-sectional analysis study in healthy adults. They basically took 4,807 men and women ages 55 and older over a 10-year follow-up period. Right, so 4,807, that's a pretty large study over 10 years. So they got a significant amount of data. They looked at calcification rate, and then of course they looked at cardiovascular mortality and death, and they also looked at all-cause mortality. So this was the conclusion of the studies. When consuming a daily amount of as little as 45 micrograms of vitamin K2, they saw a 50% reduction in arterial calcification. Nothing on the market, not pharmaceutical or natural, has ever been shown to be able to provide a 50% reduction in arterial calcification. Again, arterial calcification is the #1 risk for heart disease. They also showed a 50% reduction in cardiovascular death. So those two numbers go hand in hand. If you reduce arterial calcification, you reduce cardiovascular death. So 50% reduction in calcification, 50% in cardiovascular death. And what was extremely surprising is there was a 25% reduction in all-cause mortality. So death that was that encompassed any kind of cause. So there was a significant difference in the mortality rates of people that got adequate amounts of vitamin K2 versus people that did not. So vitamin K2 is just helping you live longer. It's providing longevity. And I think when we go further in the presentation, you'll see why that is in particular. Now, in addition to this, what's interesting is that vitamin K2 was later studied in a longevity study, in particular, looking at people who took a certain amount of vitamin K2, I think it was over 50 micrograms a day, and seeing on average how much longer they live with their peers that did not get adequate amounts of vitamin K2. And what they found on average is about a 7-year increase in longevity with the intake of vitamin K2. There was no correlation in this study with vitamin K1 at all, so vitamin K1 did not really help with cardiovascular disease and all-cause mortality. It's vitamin K2, and in this case, K27 in particular. Additional clinically proven indications. Now, remember that vitamin K2 is a very, very well-studied nutrient with massive studies. As we're talking about the Rotterdam study, 4,800 patients, the EPIC cohort study of 16,000 patients. There's another study called the Heidelberg cohort study, I think, of 13,000 plus patients. So 11,000 plus patients. The study numbers are massive, so the data is extremely strong. Here are some of the other things that they were found as well. Vitamin K2 was shown to reduce diabetes risk by 20% in Dutch population study over a 10-year period. and with 38,000 patients. So that's quite a significant study. And this is again over 10 years, so it's a longitudinal study, very powerful data. Vitamin K2 shown to decrease cancer risk. And this was a study done on 23,000 German adults, showed that higher vitamin K2 intake was associated with a lower likelihood of developing and dying of cancer. Now, this is part of what explains the reduction in all-cause mortality in the Rotterdam study, because people are reducing their risk for diabetes, they're reducing their risk for cancer, people are just dying less frequently when they're taking vitamin K2/7. Vitamin K2 is also shown to reduce prostate cancer risk by 35% in that study that I mentioned, the EPIC cohort Heidelberg study with 11,319 patients. So a significant amount of work. Now, there's other studies going on to further the research on cancer. Numerous universities in the US and the Netherlands are doing studies on vitamin K2 and diabetes. They're basically showing that people who are pre-diabetic can dramatically reduce their risk of developing diabetes by taking vitamin K2. There's protection against brain cognitive issues, and of course, cancer and osteoporosis research continues as well. But we've been studying vitamin K2 for over a decade now, and I wanted to be able to share with you guys some of the new discoveries in vitamin K2 function that we've actually come across, and in fact, we filed global patents on these. So when we started studying vitamin K2/7, we did not want to continue studying the same things that other people have already verified. We wanted to look at what else does this amazing vitamin do in the body. So our hypothesis was that perfusion, hypoxia, energy balance, and microcirculation tends to improve significantly with vitamin K2. Utilizing this unitary hypothesis, we figured out many different conditions in which vitamin K2 could function. So here's some of the highlights, the new discoveries. We have figured out that vitamin K2 functions in muscle contraction. So the process of muscles contracting requires calcium and other ion flux. And so the flux is controlled in large part by vitamin K2 because of its ability to metabolize and allow your body to utilize positively charged minerals. So if you don't get adequate amounts of vitamin K2, you tend to suffer from chronic and even sometimes idiopathic muscle cramps. So whether you're an athlete worried about muscle cramps, or you're somebody that is woken up out of bed on a frequent or semi-frequent basis because of cramping muscles in the legs and lower extremities, vitamin K2 becomes extremely critical for your muscles to function optimally. It also functions in nerve health. What we're starting to see is that vitamin K2 seems to be able to revive dead and dying nerve cells. So this applies to virtually any type of neurodegenerative diseases, things as simple as neuropathies, the tingling and numbness in the extremities, all the way to a more serious disease like Parkinson's, and I'll show some data on that particular area as well. It also functions in the mitochondria of the cell. So the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. The mitochondria is the engine that basically produces all of the energy within each and every cell. Now, what happens as one ages, or as toxicity builds up or oxidative stress builds up in the body, the mitochondria starts to get choked. And then the mitochondria stops producing energy. Once the mitochondria stops producing energy, the cell that the mitochondria is in starts to die. And once the cell starts to die, then the tissue that the cell makes up also starts to die. This is in particular what's happening with muscle degeneration and weakness as people get older, and of course, nerve tissue dysfunction as well. The nerve cells are basically dying because the mitochondria within the nerves are getting choked up and suffocating. And what we've found is that vitamin K2 plays a very important role in not only increasing the efficiency of energy being produced by mitochondria in the nerves, but also, and virtually every other tissue in the body, but also it can rescue dead and dying mitochondria. So ones that are already damaged and basically have gone dormant or have died off, it can rescue some of these cells as well. Redox function of vitamin K2 is a completely new type of chemistry for vitamin K2. As I mentioned right in the beginning of the presentation, vitamin K27 works by a chemical process called carboxylation. We've discovered that vitamin K2 works in redox functions as well. I'll talk about what that is in a couple of slides. It also functions very importantly in cardiac output. Cardiac output is a measure of the strength of the heart. How much blood can the heart pump with each beat per minute? And that cardiac output is a very, very important measure on a few different fronts. We'll talk about exactly what those are towards the end of the presentation. So here's the redox function. Mitochondrial function works by redox principles, and redox reactions are ones that control the production of ATP, the energy molecule in cells. And so basically what's happening is vitamin K27 plays in the electron transport chain. So this is the mitochondria, and this is where the electron transport chain occurs. In fact, there's one vitamin that most people are familiar with, vitamin CoQ10. That's how vitamin CoQ10 helps the heart and helps cells because it functions in the same electron transport chain in order to increase the amount of ATP being produced. Now, vitamin K instead does fit in a similar place, but as we've seen in our studies, may even work a little bit better than CoQ10 in this electron transport facilitation. And this allows for this enzyme here, ATP synthase, to produce large amounts of ATP and excrete out of the cell. So here's a mitochondrial bioenergetics graph. This kind of illustrates how vitamin K27 improves mitochondrial ATP production. This study and this test has been done at, I believe, Texas Tech, and this is done in an in vitro system called the seahorse. It's the #1 way of studying what exactly is happening with mitochondria in the body. So let me go through this with you. The first part is basal respiration. So this is the amount of energy the mitochondria is producing in your cells when you're just sitting around. So your heart rate's not elevated, you're basically just relaxing. Then what they do is they add in a mitochondrial toxin called oligomycin, and that basically shuts down mitochondrial respiration. That shuts down energy production because now you've added this mitochondrial toxin. So now ATP production is measured by this basal rate to this low shutdown level. That gives you your basal ATP production. Now what they do at this point then is they add something called FCCP, which is a mitochondrial stimulant, and it's a very potent stimulant, so it shoots the ATP production up to a maximum, which is your physiological maximum, the maximum amount of ATP and energy that your cell can produce at that time. So this maximal respiration rate, when you subtract it from the basal respiration rate, gives you a measure called a spare respiratory capacity. The spare respiratory capacity is the number that indicates how strong your mitochondria is and how much energy capacity it has to respond when it's needed. For example, if you're just sitting around and then something dangerous comes along and you have to get up and sprint, your cells are going to be turning to your spare capacity in order to provide the energy for that sprint. And if your spare capacity is low or your mitochondria is weak and it has a very low level of spare capacity, then your body and your physiology can't keep up with the needs. Then they add another mitochondrial toxin, like an antimycin, and that basically shuts down ATP production all the way down to the bottom as well. So then this gives us another verification of the maximal respiration rate as well. So now looking at this and understanding this form happened when we added vitamin K27. So this is without vitamin K27. So as you can see, when you start adding vitamin K27 to the mitochondria, even the basal respiration rate tends to be almost measurably higher than without vitamin K27. So the amount of energy that you're producing just sitting around that's available to you is higher than you were before vitamin K27. Now, what's really significant is when you look at this difference here. This is the spare capacity for the non-vitamin K2 treated sample, and this is the spare capacity for the vitamin K2 treated sample. So if you look at the massive difference here, there's about a 40 to 50% increase in the amount of spare capacity that the mitochondria now has just by adding vitamin K27. So now your mitochondria can respond for you with almost 40 or 50% more energy to keep your body functioning the way it's supposed to function. Now, vitamin K2 as an electron carrier, as I mentioned, has been studied in a more devastating disease called Parkinson's. And this is a study that showed this neuroscientist actually in Belgium, in Leuven, in University of Leuven, succeeded in undoing the effects of one of the genetic defects that leads to Parkinson's using just vitamin K27. So, and they conclude that his discovery gives hope to Parkinson's patients. What's great about this is what they were able to show is something that we had already discovered vitamin K2 to do in the body, but they fortunately studied this for us in a Parkinson's model. So because vitamin K2 can regenerate dead and dying nerve cells, what's happening in Parkinson's is nerve cells start to die off slowly. And so if vitamin K2 is present, it should be able to regenerate those nerve cells. Now, we studied this ourselves, but we studied it in neuropathy. We didn't go into the Parkinson's space, and we started off with a 30-patient study for 8 weeks. And these are people that are complaining of high frequency of neuropathy in their body. So that's numbness, tingling, and all this discomfort in the extremities. And what we were able to show is that there was more than an 80% recovery of the neuropathy symptoms in just 8 weeks of dosing vitamin K27. And we looked at neuropathy that was due to B12 deficiency and or diabetes, which of course then cuts off the microcirculation in the extremity. So we saw a significant amount of improvement in people with neuropathy, which means dead and dying nerve cells in the extremities. Then we looked at cardiac output as well, because one of the things that we concluded when you look at mitochondrial function is that the highest number of mitochondria in your body is in your heart. The heart per capita has more mitochondria than any other part of the body. And in particular, that's because the heart is a muscle that's beating constantly and beating all the time. And so it requires a lot of energy. And one of the things that happens as you get older or as you exercise heavily is that the mitochondria of the heart starts to get choked up, and something called cardiac output, which is the amount of blood that your heart can pump out with each and every beat, starts to go down. So we just published this study in Alternative Therapies in Health and Medicine. It just published this month, which is July of 2017, where we showed that the consumption of megaquinone, which is our K2 product containing high doses of K2 supplement in 8 weeks, was associated with an increased maximal cardiac output during exercise. And what we saw was about a 13% increase in cardiac output in an average person. Now that amounts to about 900 liters of more blood pumping through your body in a 24-hour period. That's a significant amount of more oxygen, nutrients, red blood cells, white blood cells, and so on being pumped through your system in a 24-hour period that has huge implications for overall health and longevity. So we call this arguably the most important anti-aging nutrient, because as much as athletes require increased cardiac output, because keep in mind, the more blood your heart can pump with each beat, the harder you can go at a higher level of workload. So whether you're running or cycling or swimming or doing any sort of physical activity, even lifting, your body fails when it runs out of its oxygen and nutrient supply. So when the heart can't keep up with the red blood, with blood demand for the tissue, then your muscles start to fail. Now, if we can increase the amount of blood being pumped by 13% with each and every beat of the heart, it allows you to function at a much higher level at even a lower heart rate than normal. One area, however, that cardiac output plays a significant role is in aging. So the mitochondrial free radical theory of aging proposes that mitochondrial free radicals, and that's typically produced by normal respiration in the cell, causes oxidative damage and basically chokes up the mitochondria. And according to this theory, the accumulation of this oxidative damage is the main driving force behind the aging process, because what happens during aging is tissue starts to die. This study actually was published, I think it was published in 1998, where they took samples, tissue samples between a 5-year-old and a 90-year-old man. And they compared the tissue samples to see what all the noticeable differences were. And the only difference that they were able to discern was that the 90-year-old man had tissue that contained 95% damaged mitochondria, compared to almost no noticeable damage in mitochondria in the 5-year-old. And that's the only difference in the tissue. So as the mitochondria gets damaged, the body becomes weaker and more frail. That affects every single organ in your body, every single nerve cell, your cardiac muscles, everything that keeps you alive. It starts to disintegrate slowly as the mitochondria start to die out. So this was a very telling study that looked at physiological samples, and the only difference they could really pick out was a number of dysfunctional mitochondria between older people and younger people. And here we have a nutrient, a simple vitamin that can rescue these mitochondria from this type of oxidative stress and disintegration. So imagine that this 90-year-old man, instead of having 95% damaged mitochondria, only had 50% damaged mitochondria. This 90-year-old man would be far more active. His risk for disease would be much lower. He would have much better memory functions, much better metabolic functions, and so on. Studies also indicate that a decrease in cardiac output happens with aging, at rest, and even with exercise. So this whole cardiac output measurement that we looked at tends to start going down once you start getting older. It's a hallmark of aging. And of course, if cardiac output goes down, the amount of blood and nutrients being pumped through the body also goes down. This study concluded that a substantially reduced output was a consistent finding in older subjects. So this is, again, a hallmark of the aging process, is not only the mitochondria dying, but then your cardiac output levels go down as well. So that each cell in your body is becoming weaker, but your heart is also becoming weaker subsequently. This is another study that shows the level of coronary artery calcification with and without diabetes. This is basically showing that vitamin K2, which is the one thing that can remove calcification in your coronary arteries, has a significant impact on your mortality. For example, coronary artery calcification rates dramatically reduces survivability. And that's in non-diabetic subjects. When you look at in diabetic subjects, coronary artery calcification rates even further reduces longevity and causes mortality. So coronary artery calcification is a big predictor of mortality in general. And then if you have diabetes on top of it, the prediction becomes even stronger. So far, let's review. We're talking about mitochondrial deficiency. That's one of the hallmarks of aging and, of course, the development of disease. The reduction in cardiac output is also another hallmark of aging, and it's associated with the development of disease. Coronary artery calcification is a major predictor of mortality and survivability. If you look here at this first graph, at this first line, low levels of calcification is associated with drastically reduced amounts of mortality. When you have high degrees of calcification, as in this line, the risk for mortality increases quite significantly. So you see survival rates drop very dramatically, and it's all dictated by the amount of calcification in the arteries. So biological aging, in conclusion, is a factor of mitochondrial health, cardiac output, and vascular health in terms of calcification. So it's easy to see that all three of these factors are actually intertwined with each other, because as your mitochondria get weaker and your heart get weaker, your cardiac output gets weaker. As your cardiac output gets weaker, you have less and less nutrients to all of the different tissues in your body, and you start to start to create calcification in your vascular system, stiffening of the arteries, oxidative stress, and so on. So all of these are tied together, and vitamin K2 plays a significant role in improving the health of each of these systems in your body. You basically end up getting better perfusion. You end up removing calcium from arteries. You slow down the progression of diabetes, and we showed in the previous slide that diabetes dramatically accelerates mortality rates in people with coronary artery calcification. Every cell in the body gets more nutrients and more blood supply just from sitting around and pumping more blood. Increases in mitochondrial function is something that's observed so that each and every cell can actually produce more energy, and you regenerate dying cells faster, so your body becomes kind of an energy machine, similar to the way you felt when you were 10, 15, 20 years younger. It prevents aging-related tissue degeneration. It's essentially nature's fountain of youth. It provides all of the effects that are required to slow down the aging process and improve vitality and improve wellness throughout life. The dose that's required for all of these effects is between 100 and 300 micrograms a day. And there's a linear dose-dependent ratio, meaning the higher the dose, the more the benefit. We've actually done our studies on cardiac output at 320 micrograms per day. And that's what the megaquinone product is set up as, is at 320 micrograms per day, because we see that all of these functions occur at 320 micrograms a day. We don't see the cardiac output changes and the mitochondrial changes at doses much lower than 300 micrograms a day. So what can vitamin K2 do for you? Essentially, it prevents and reverses heart disease, osteoporosis, diabetes, cancers, dementia, joint health. So it also plays a very critical role in the development of joint tissue and facial cranial development. That was all the work with Weston A. Price Institute. Skin health is studies that show that collagen and elastin function is reduced when calcification starts to occur, and collagen and elastin lose their elasticity. Dental health, your bones in your jaw are completely dependent on vitamin K2 for forming really strong, deep, and accommodating bones for your teeth. Muscle function, of course, as we showed, neuropathy and even conditions like Parkinson's, mitochondrial restoration, cardiac function, and overall aging as well. So vitamin K2 does all of these things as a single nutrient, single vitamin. And we are all subclinically deficient in this incredibly important nutrient. So it's scary to think that this nutrient that is absolutely essential and conducts all of these functions, we get almost none of it in the Western diet. Hence, the prevalence rate of heart disease continues to grow. The prevalence rate of osteoporosis continues to grow. The prevalence rate of diabetes, cancers, dementia, all of these things continue to grow despite the wide use of numerous prescription drugs. And in our view, it's because of the deficiency of vitamin K2.